Good morning, everybody. This is Stewart Dalby in White Hart Hotel, where Mirador broadcasting from Mirador Television. My guest this morning is Tony Robinson, a friend and colleague of mine from the Financial Times days. And he this morning is going to have a conversation with me about his time in South Africa as a foreign correspondent. Tony, how did you get to be in South Africa?
Well, it was not the usual way of going to Africa. I mean, most people go to Africa, people who've spent their lives thinking about Africa. I only went to South Africa because I got thrown out of the Soviet Union in 1983, which actually was, probably a good thing, but certainly it helped me to understand in a very different way than most of my colleagues, I think, what was going on in South Africa, what was likely to happen if the ANC took over. And I was nothing like as optimistic as anybody else, thinking that, because I'd seen, anybody who's been watching the history of Africa, post-colonial Africa, will know that, the end of the colonial regimes did not usher in, lands of milk and honey, but that most people in most of those countries have actually lived worse, or certainly their living standard. No, in many ways they live worse, partly because population has doubled, partly, but largely because and this is particularly the case in South Africa. South Africa is by far the most advanced and most developed country on the continent. It was the dynamo for the continent, but it requires, for a dynamo to function, for a modern economy to function, it requires a lot of very competent people, a lot of very strong institutions, international trade, all these things. And the ANC guys who came in had no experience of any of that.
Can I just explain what the ANC is?
Yes, sure.
The ANC is the actually opposition, so to speak, against the regimes, the white regimes, as was. I mean, in South Africa, there was the Afrikaners, and there were 5 million of those, and there were about 3 million of English origin, weren't there?
No, nothing like as much as that. No. 5 million total, really.
Yeah.
Less.
Yeah. And so these were, in opposition, really, because of apartheid.
Well, the thing is, look, the African National Congress did, as you rightly say, grow out of, rising national feeling amongst the 90-odd percentage of the population who, under the apartheid regime, were basically, and certainly in the early years of the apartheid regime, they were basically to be treated as
slaves.
Slaves. Well, yeah.
Would you put it as strongly as that?
No, not exactly. Not exactly slaves. I mean, they were paid wages, for example, the mine workers and so on and so on, but very low. And the thing was that the ideology, the original ideology of the Afrikaners was basically that, which is a very religious, primitive kind of religious belief that the blacks were inferior and they were only good for chopping wood, for hewing wood and carrying water. Basically, that they were the people to do the basic grunt work, whereas and the white and to a certain extent the mixed race colored people with better education, because education was a key, that they would provide the technology, the finance, the know-how, the management, all these things on a totally subservient but huge and numerical majority.
Yeah. Yes, they did. But how did they progress from this actual sort of split, as you see what I mean? Yeah.
Well, there was a huge illusion. Well, look, firstly, let us say, in 1976, and I believe you were there in South Africa.
I was in
too.
Soweto.
You were in Soweto
when
at
it
that
happened,
time.
when it was him.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, the seeds of revolt, if you like, were really it goes back to 1970. Well, it goes back beyond that, but in 1976. School children took to the streets in Soweto and in Indiana and other townships, but Soweto was the big one, because the Afrikaner government tried to impose the Afrikaans as the language of instruction in black schools.
Yeah.
Well, for the black majority, Afrikaans was the language of oppression, and English was the language which helped them to communicate amongst themselves, because to say that Africa is a country of black and white doesn't do justice to the complexity of it. There are at least 8, and many more subgroups, but at least 8 basic, well, you can call them tribal or national divisions within that community. The Zulus, the Tswana, and so on and so forth. And they all speak different languages. Some of them are connected, not all of them. And English, as in India, English is, and the world at large now, it was very much the global language, and that's what black Africans wanted to be taught in. They did not want this kind of Dutch peasant language, to be thrust down their throat.
That's quite, yeah, but it expanded from this, what seems, in retrospect, seems rather a simple bloody issue about school books, brings out this bloody great revolution, there must have been an incredible pent-up force for the black people to burst out. Must have been, because remember when I was going earlier than you were.
Yeah.
I mean, people used to, as you're walking along, they take your hat off
I
to
know,
you. And
I know,
there's tremendous servility.
And they had to get off the pavement. It was absolutely humiliating.
And they couldn't go on the same bus.
No.
They couldn't be on the same.
Humiliating.
They were treated like slaves.
They were humiliating. Well, an underclass. They were treated. I mean, the irony is, the Afrikaners came to power in 1948, and they proceeded to run the kind of racist regime that we just spent 6 years fighting against, again in Germany. And ironically, the South Africans, and my father-in-law, one of them, fought very bravely on our side. Although there was a big division, there were a lot of Afrikaners who wanted to side with the Germans, not with the Brits, because don't forget the Boer War, where where the Brits fought very well. They basically took the land away from the Boers, and that's interesting because the blacks, the blacks. The Afrikaners essentially see themselves as a liberating movement. They liberated their own people from the Brits. You see, before Soweto, white politics was essentially just about the Boers and the Bolsheviks, and not the Boers and the Bolsheviks, the Boers and the Brits essentially, and they were fighting it out. The blacks didn't count. They didn't count. They didn't have any political influence whatsoever. That all changed with 1976, and with the Soweto rising, and you're right, it reflected that huge uprising of resentment and so on and so on, and frustration. But the thing is that the enlightened, the Verlichter, as they called them, Afrikaners, they took on board that this old apartheid pattern was simply had no future. And it's from 1976 on that you started to get some real movement in South African politics and in South African society. The whites realized they had to start educating. They desperately needed an educated and trained black working class first. What they failed to do, they didn't have the time. They wanted to do it, but by the time they got round to realizing that the basic thing that was needed in South Africa was the development of a black middle class with a stake in the system, not in the apartheid system, but in a system whereby all the people in this incredibly complicated country would actually work together, the Rainbow Nation, in the famous words of Nelson Mandela. Exactly. That was the dream. That was the dream, and it was in the belief that there was a faint possibility. Most people didn't believe more than that. That with the collapse of the Soviet Union, that actually it might be possible for whites to give up their monopoly of power and to share power without the fear of not only being overwhelmed by the numbers, but by being taken over by a bunch of ideologues who wanted to impose a Soviet-style communist state in South Africa. Now, people used to think that I was mad when I listened to all this talk, and I thought, well, I quite see what the Afrikaners are worried about, because in 1977, Brezhnev, the Soviet boss, sent 50,000 Cuban troops to support so-called liberation movements in Angola and Mozambique, which had been vacated by the Portuguese, whose empire in Africa had lasted 400 years.
And I was there as well.
You were there for that.
I'll tell you the whole thing about the Angola War.
Yeah.
Where Tiny Rollins was after the diamonds.
Exactly.
See, in Angola was Swimbi's bit, right? But the Congo was up the north, right? So they were after the oil, and Savimbi what's it? This is quite a funny story. Tiny Rollins was in Savimbi, so he had this Learjet, and he took a few of us into Angola, and then we were flown back to Lusaka, right, which was the capital of Zambia, wasn't it? And when I got back from Learjet, it turned out that the Civil Commander had declared a state of emergency because of food shortages. Well, so quickly, thought, well, I better write a story about this. So I went down and I wrote a story, and it said, in a preemptive move, President Kaunda has actually declared a state of emergency because of the food shortages. When it came, I don't type too very well, so I went back to the bloke who sent the thing, and he said, in a primitive move, President Kaunda was actually, as a status character, a primitive move, to actually primitive for a state of emergency because it was it. And of course, calling Kaunda a primitive man was the worst thing in the world I could have done. And me and Bruce Loudon of the Daily Telegraph were shipped off to Lusaka Central Prison. And who should get us out? Well, Bridget Bloom, who was very friendly with most African got hold of Jim. She was our Africa editor. She was. She got a hold of Jim Callahan, and he managed to spring us after 5 days. God, frightened the life out of me.
Yeah, well, I mean that Africa has completely disappeared. Oh, completely disappeared now.
Go back to your.
But the thing about Angola, that the Soviet Union was failing at home. I mean, it's been a failure all the way through, actually, in my view. But
and the Cubans would follow.
Yeah, but they still had this need to demonstrate that actually, no, this was the wave of the future, and that the Soviet Union was advancing, and so on and so forth. And so they saw this opportunity, this vacuum, which had suddenly appeared in southern Central Africa, and they sent in 50,000 Cuban troops to ensure that the left wing, all these labels don't mean a thing really, but I mean that they will be inclined towards Moscow.
Mm.
Now, this, of course, absolutely terrified the South Africans. So for 30 years, basically, you had these border wars. You had, Savimbi, who you mentioned, was supported by the South Africans. Hundreds, possibly thousands, of soldiers, certainly white soldiers, but an awful lot of other people died in these conflicts just over the border in Angola and Mozambique. And it was at that point, that basically the South Africans decided they are not going to give up Namibia, for example. Yeah. And so there was a war in Namibia, a border war in Namibia as well. Those were very tricky times. But the point is, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, I was present at negotiations in Brazzaville between essentially the South Africans, the Soviets, the Americans, the Brits, with a lot of other secret services, kind of circulating around, the whole thing. It was a big, including the Israelis. It was a big issue. And I managed to get the deputy foreign minister, the Soviet deputy foreign minister, Anatoly Adamyshin. I heard them talking. When I arrived there, I went into the lobby and waited to hear Russian voices. I saw these two guys go past and walk towards the lift, and I followed them and got in the lift with them. And by the time we got to the 9th floor, where they were staying, we'd established that Anatoly and I shared a common love of Italy, and he had spent 6 years in the Soviet embassy in Rome, as I had spent 8 years in Italy. So we chatted away in Italian, and I said to him, "Look, after the session, would you mind briefing me on the Soviet position?" "Fine," he said, "I'll do that." Anyway, the talks went on and on and on. And then eventually they all came out of the session. And the journalists we were all around in a sort of semicircle, and there was a space. Anatoly saw me, waved, walked across this no man's land, took me by the arm, and led me out to the garden of the hotel beside the Congo River, with slushing past behind us. And he said, "Look, I can't obviously tell you what's been going on in these negotiations. They are ongoing. But I do want to tell you what's going on in the Kremlin and in our foreign policy." And he said, "We have decided," this was when oil was $10 a barrel and the Soviet Union was clearly bankrupt. They couldn't afford 50,000 to support 50,000 Cubans. They couldn't even afford to eat at home. I remember in that period, there was nothing. Anyway, he said, "So we've decided, right, no more ideology. From now on, the Soviet Union is going to base its foreign policy on its Soviet national interest." And we looked around the world, and where was the place where we were spending more money for no national purpose whatsoever? Africa was clear. So my job is to come here to persuade the Americans that from now on, we want to be part of the solution of global problems and no longer part of the problem. So that was a very, very crucial moment. And it was getting the Cubans out, which led first to the independence of Namibia, which was a kind of trial run. And then finally, in February 1990, F.W. de Klerk, the Prime Minister, declared that from now on, the ANC was unbanned, the Communist Party was unbanned, the trade unions would be free to act, and so on and so forth. So that 1990, thanks to the exodus of the Cuban troops and the Soviets moving into a cooperative phase with the Americans. That gave the Afrikaners the confidence that that this was a get out of jail card, because they knew that apartheid didn't work, and they were desperately looking for another system. And what they hoped for, and they've been talking to Mandela for ages, and they shared Mandela's vision of the Rainbow Nation.
Was he out of jail by then?
No. Well, he did come out of jail. Yeah. That was all part of the process.
Oh, I see.
Mandela was released, and then all these other things happened at the same time.
Right.
So Mandela was released, and so on. Now, the problem was that Mandela, basically the opposition to apartheid internally, it was basically organized around in a loose sort of confederation called the United Democratic Front.
Yeah.
There were church movements, there were trade unions, there were all kinds of social organizations. It was civil society in action against apartheid. And there were plenty of whites, coloreds, Indians, and a lot of big Indian community there, very rich as well. And there was this huge sense, come on, Forza Italia, like Forza Italia. Come on, South Africa. This is our moment. Now, let's leave apartheid behind us and let us get together and let us negotiate a new constitution, and with all the guarantees that we could possibly think of, and so on and so forth. And that was the situation up to 1994. And indeed, originally there was a sort of coalition government, and then the Afrikaners basically, the ANC, which had been essentially taken over by the Moscow side, by the exiles, by these guys who didn't know anything. They've been in exile all these years. Not only did they know nothing about,
I remember that.
Not only did they nothing about the realities of South Africa, the South African economy, South African society, they had no idea at all. They were in exile. Not only that, they didn't have any other skills either. They were just political intriguers. They were your classic politicians with no other skills and no other talents, really.
Yeah.
And suddenly,
so where did he go from there? Now I'm trying to pick up the plot again. So Mandela was there, and he became president.
Yeah.
Right. Now, as I recall, yeah. And also the second president was, guess who? Thabo
Mbeki.
Who was at Sussex University.
I know. He was. Yeah, he was.
Do you know, he was a small person.
Yeah.
So apparently he had terrible phobias about being small, as well as being black and all the rest of it.
I know.
And I must not say this aloud, but when he used to go up to the pub there, he was part of the international school and I was there. And he said, he was always talking about I can't say it, white P something.
Yeah.
White, well,
yeah, all right. Yeah.
Why?
No, I know. He was. I know. I mean, he's well known as a fan. I mean, it's true. I mean, look, I met him up in. I went up to Lusaka with my foreign editor to see him, and and I must say, I listened to what they were saying, and I said, look, guys, excuse me, but they were coming out with all this Marxist stuff, and I said, guys, don't you realize the Soviet Union has collapsed? These kind of ideas, didn't work in the Soviet Union, and just look around you in the rest of Africa. Just look what these kind of what these left-wing ideas have done. It's just not on. If I said to him at one point, it got quite heated. I said, look, Thabo, if you want to take on white men's ideas, and they are white men, Marx, Lenin, all these guys, for God's sake, don't choose these ones who are clearly a failure. Choose the intelligent ones. There's plenty of those.
But now you've got now you've got a rainbow coalition, if you like to put it that way, a proper constitution and so forth and so on. And under Mandela, for example, But isn't the place now descended into a place of corruption and robberies and thuggeries and God knows what else?
Look, if you read F.W. de Klerk's account of the negotiations, it's very enlightening. A lot of people don't like de Klerk. I had a huge respect for him because what he was saying was, look at Zimbabwe. He said, look at other countries. Zimbabwe, 90% Shona tribal.
Yeah.
He said, you're never going to have a democracy.
When Ndebele got the job, didn't they?
No, well, the Ndebele got slaughtered by the
Shona.
Got slaughtered by Mugabe. 20,000 of them got slaughtered. You said if you've got that kind of 90 to 10%, 90% Shona, 10% Matabidi, there's going to be a permanent majority and a permanent minority, and you forget about democracy under those circumstances. He said South Africa is different. He said we have these 8 or 10 or 12 or how many groupings, depends how you judge them. He said none of them has a minority. The Zulus, the two most important ones, the Zulus and the Xhosa, are at that point were about 5 million each. Fierce rivals, and that rivalry took place inside the ANC, which essentially moved from Leninism to tribalism in 10 years, essentially, because there was the original ANC leaders, post-independence leaders, were all Xhosas mainly, and then Zuma. Jacob Zuma, won power in 2007, largely because of the terrible mistakes that Thabo Mbeki made over the AIDS, the AIDS epidemic. I mean, he said this is all a white man's plot. This is, and he had all these crazy ideas about eating African foods and you won't get it and all that kind of stuff, and millions of people, well, I don't know how many people died. A lot of people died as a result.
I've not been following it too much, but as I understand it, Zuma and people places lawlessness, corruption,
the gangsters,
thievery, everything, but it's actually a wild West Valley sort of country now, isn't it?
It is, unfortunately.
I mean, isn't that what it is today?
Look,
there's tremendous lawlessness, isn't it? And tremendous corruption. And
it's desperately sad. It's desperately sad. There are still some great people in South Africa. It's a country. It's an extraordinarily beautiful country, a varied country. It has tremendous agricultural potential. It had a great farming system.
Tremendous minerals, oil.
That's right.
Not South Africa.
No. Well, they think there is oil and gas offshore. They haven't really found it yet. But the thing is, it has vast amounts of coal. Well, gold now is pretty depleted because gold was the beginning of the South African economy. That's what attracted tens of thousands of miners and so on and so tough guys, by the way. I mean, the South Africans are a tough bunch. They're not pushovers for anybody. So it was an economy based on its mineral resources. And the problem is with that, all countries, you look everywhere, the Soviet Union, Brazil. Well, not so much Brazil, but certainly most countries, or Venezuela, Angola, countries which have huge natural resources, it's very difficult to get a middle class, which you need for democracy, if you've got wealth concentrated, created not by man but by God, and concentrated in the hands of a few totally ruthless guys who's either salted away in Switzerland and London, or basically, and then oppress the rest of the country who remain in poverty and so on and so forth. This was not the case in South Africa. Gold did not lie on the surface. When I was there, they were digging for gold 4 kilometers deep.
Mm.
You needed tremendous organization. You needed mathematicians. You needed engineers. You needed scientists. You needed a hugely sophisticated organization in order to get this stuff out of the ground. And not just gold, but platinum. And the platinum, there's a river of platinum running through just north of Johannesburg, which is actually now much more valuable. The palladium and all rhodium and all those platinum type metals, they are now hugely more valuable than gold. Actually, gold is pretty well depleted, but that required that it's the needs of the mining industry created the need for ports, for railways, for roads, for this fantastic infrastructure. What the last 30 years have demonstrated is that the African National Congress, the people who took over power without sharing it with their Marxist ideology, they had no idea, and they basically kicked out people on the basis of race. The white skilled and entrepreneurial, well, the skilled class anyway, the skilled working class and the skilled professional classes. These were, and the administrators, I mean, to administer a sophisticated hospital system, education system, and everything else requires trained, skilled, educated people. And unfortunately, instead of saying, look, let us forget our Marxist ideas, let us actually look at South Africa as it is, let us work together with, not just replace with ignorant and untrained and uneducated people, let us realize that the greatest resource of this country is not its minerals or even it is its people and the skills of the people. And that is the huge mistake that they've made. And so instead of fostering and developing all those talents and all those skills and all those infrastructures which were there, they've trashed them. It's terrible. It is a terrible destruction. For 30 years, they've been destroying South Africa as well.
What the NHS,
Yeah, that government, the infrastructure, the roads. Well, the roads. I mean, I'm surprised. I mean, flying over, the highways are still there, and there are trucks and cars still running along them. And in the big cities, this decay has taken place at an accelerated pace, particularly over the last 10 years. In the initial years, when people were still optimistic, both foreign investors and people inside the country, there was a great investment boom, in fact, and the economy did extremely well at the beginning. It was only later when it became more and more obvious that the people who were in charge of running the country were incompetent, and not only incompetent, they were gangsters.
Yeah, well, exactly. That's what I was saying.
Yeah.
So where are we now then? I mean, do you think it's in a very dire state?
Well, we are. Look, we are now at a stage where, for 20 years, the country has been run down. For 20 years, there's been a steady emigration of many of the brightest and the best of South Africa, and not just whites, by the way. But I mean, it's a much more nuanced community than just black white, so that is the tremendous strain, and that is I think at the basis of the problem now. Looking forward, you cannot create. It's easy to destroy an institution, a company, a railway system, a port system, a mining system, an agricultural system. It's easy to destroy, and they've been doing it. But it's reaching the point now where they've got rolling blackouts, for example. Up to 10 hours a day of no electricity. When I was there, the problem in 1986, I went round to see the bosses. I interviewed the bosses of ESCOM, which is the electricity corporation. And their problem was, listen, we've invested too much. We've got too much capacity. We don't know what to do with it. And you know what their decision? Only at that point did they say, oh my God, we've got 20 million blacks who don't have electricity. Let's supply some to them. I mean, it's not only the blacks have been stupid. I mean, the whites have been stupid too. To wait so late before trying to use the resources of that country while they still had the political power to do so in a much more determined effort with the conscious effort to create a politically responsible, socially responsible black middle class, which of course was the aspiration of the ANC, but unfortunately it just wasn't possible in the way that they did it. So it's a sad story, man. It's a really
long walk to freedom, as they say.
It's a long walk to freedom. It's a long, freedom doesn't come into it, actually. You're not free if you're starving. And another thing which of course the ANC didn't do, it didn't continue to secure the borders. The population, when I left, it was less than 30 million. This is 30 years ago. Now the population is 60 million. And a lot of these are people who came in from Angola and Mozambique, from these war-torn areas, and they came across the border with only one thing, with an AK-47. Right? So one of the reasons why for the deterioration of law and order, and subsequently, a lot of tension between immigrant communities who tend to be much better educated than the South Africans themselves, much more motivated, much more competent. And that is a source of deep anger and frustration amongst the native South African blacks who are suffering from the lack of education, in the apartheid years, and the destruction of the deterioration of what was there by African ANC-linked teachers with strong trade unions and so on and so forth, without the skills and the training of the people that they replace. So it's in education, in health, in all these things. You've had this terrible deterioration of standards and quality, and it's tragic. It needn't have been that had Mandela and the UDF interior people been able to get control, not these Marxist Leninists.
Well, it hasn't happened, has it? That's it. So,
it hasn't happened.
So that's it, really.
Well, no, it's not it. It's not it. It's not completely over, because despite everything. I mean, the South Africa was such an amazing country before, and even after the last, say, 20 years of deterioration, plus the disinvestment which took place before the end of apartheid, as foreign and Western governments tried to force the Afrikaner government at the time, the apartheid government, to move faster and so on and so forth. And so there was a lot of disinvestment beforehand, which weakened the system. So this process of weakening started actually before the end of apartheid, and thanks to people abroad who again naively thought all it took was to get rid of the Afrikaners, and then the ANC government would somehow create a new Shangri-La in South Africa. Didn't happen.
No.
Didn't happen.
Okay, let's call it a day now, shall we?
All right.
Yeah, lovely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. A stimulating debate and story. We will be back tomorrow morning at 8:30 as usual with a look at the papers. Liza Page comes along with the alternative view at 10 o'clock. And as of this morning, who the hell knows what happens on this television station? I don't. Good day.